So yeah, kind of on the topic of small business, I've got another article we can look at. An article in Reuters called "Over 80% of U.S. small businesses expect longer impact of pandemic," according to a survey. And so there is a company called Veeam that is like a money transmitter kind of company, but recently they've been able to. They were taking part in the PPP loans. Processing applications on behalf of clients for the PPP loans. And as part of that, what they did is they did a survey that allowed the small business owners to kind of give their outlook on the economy and what they think is going to happen. And so what they found is what we might have expected that they would find is that things are pretty bleak right now. And so 90% of the companies that they surveyed are bracing for economic slowdown. 65% of them had submitted applications for aid. But one of the things that they found was interesting is that there was surprising resilience among small businesses as they've been pivoting to do different things to try to brace themselves for this. And so a lot of what you would think you would see, which is that small businesses would struggle with being shut down, they've found ways to persist because they're able to pivot and because they're able to change what they do more effectively or more quickly than larger businesses. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. One of the other things it brought up was that, as you would expect, liquidity was a key pain point. But even though, so people are trying to take on more credit, they're trying to decrease operating expenses and whatnot. But even with all of that, it turned out that a quarter of businesses were still investing in new technology in hopes that they could better prepare themselves for the long-term effects of this whole coronavirus. And so I guess what I wanted to ask is kind of now that we're further into the pandemic, like how do you advise a business kind of dealing between, if they're looking at shuttering or pivoting without knowing the future, how do you advise a business on when it's right to pivot versus when it's right to shutter and kind of give in to the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a hard, I guess that's a hard thing to advise on. I think the one thing I would say is just that I think the recovery effort is and the economy, it's going to be a slow go. Like I don't think we're going to see this major bounce back that everyone is expecting to happen immediately. And I think it's going to take a long time for people to feel comfortable making purchases outside of necessities. I see that very much so that, you know, every time you turn on the news is about unemployment, economic insecurity, and that drives a real like wedge into most people on expenditures outside of necessities. And so if you're operating in a business that isn't deemed essential, if you're outside of food, shelter, clothing, stuff like that, and you're more in the luxury brand or, kind of on that, what do they call it, syntax stuff or any of the externalities, technology, toys, stuff like that. I think that those industries, especially in the travel industry and stuff like that, might see a slower climb back up, so I think it's market, depends on your market segment for your business. But I think it's, like you said, it's completely up in the air how this all goes. But if I was a betting man, I would bet that this is going to be a slow climb back into a normal, quote unquote, normal spending market.
I like answers that are not. I think this answer about when is the right time to pivot and should you go all in on a pivot. To me, I feel like I think you can answer it from the standpoint of, does it actually hurt anything to make that pivot? Is that pivot something that maybe you were putting off that would have been good for your business anyway, right? And so I think about that from examples of like most retail going online. I think that, it's been true before the coronavirus crisis that having an online presence and being able to sell through online is a important part of your revenue stream, and should be an important part of your revenue stream to be long-term successful and sustainable as a retail operation. Or alternatively, if you're in a consumer good business, having a direct-to-consumer stream that goes straight to the consumer through some kind of online e-commerce platform as part of your revenue stream, as opposed to just selling in big box stores or just selling in to wholesalers or distributors, has been an important strategic kind of anchor point for consumer products now for many years. And so, you know, a lot of times what companies have found is that it's it was still very difficult to make it as big as they wanted to make it just with direct to consumer. And so, you know, it was still true that in order to become really kind of a big name player, you had to have a good wholesale and distribution game plan, and you had to have, and if you were the kind of product that would be in a big box store, that was something that you'd want to achieve as well. But anytime you look at a consumer good company and you look and if they've got a strong direct to consumer brand and revenue stream, you look at that and that's a great asset. And it was a great asset before the current crisis. And so it would be a great asset during and after it, right? And so I think for those companies that are looking at that and saying, well, is it time to pivot to, like, if I'm a consumer good company and I didn't have a direct to consumer channel, a robust direct to consumer channel, and I'm scratching my head right now wondering, should I pivot to that? I think the answer is unequivocally yes. And because it doesn't hurt you, right? I mean, even if your brick and mortar presence comes back as a viable business in the next 12 to 18 months, and you're able to do well there too, how does it hurt you to develop your direct to consumer business right now online? It doesn't, right? It only serves to help you. So I guess my philosophy on that is you should be going all in on it just in case, because who knows on the other side what's going to happen. What we do know for sure is that direct to consumer through e-commerce is a thing, and it is a place for you to make money. It was before the crisis, it is during the crisis, and it will be after the crisis. So why not pivot to going all in on something like that, right? And I think we're going to have other articles where we talk about here, or another article where we talk about professional service firms and working at home, but that would be another example of, it was something that we could have done before the crisis that a lot of companies are benefiting from. And why not? Why waste? You know what they say, that whole thing that we say, you know, never waste a good crisis. Why waste a good crisis? Was that Churchill who said that? Why waste a good, don't never waste a good crisis? Why waste a good crisis here, right? There's things that we probably should be doing for our businesses. So if the question is, should we go all in and do them? Yeah, do them. They're good for you anyway. Do them.
Well, and I think exactly to your point, Ty, you can probably ask yourself the question, is the pivot going to do one of those things that my business should be doing anyway? Diversifying revenue streams, bringing in is the pivot something I should have done a long time ago? Like you said, going digital or something like that. I think it really depends on the pivot. Now, if you're going from like a yoga studio to financial advice to somebody, you might rethink that pivot. But, if it makes sense for your business and it's going to, like hopefully strengthen it, you got to kind of put all your eggs in the basket there if you're fighting to keep your head above water, So
to kind of summarize, it kind of ultimately boils down to how likely you were going to do that pivot already anyway, and then an analysis of kind of what the barriers to entry are of that pivot, and can we sustain those costs needed to make those changes. And so as long as those two are in place, as long as the business was already going to do something like this and we can afford those costs, then at that situation, it makes sense to pivot, is kind of what it sounds like we're finding. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. But I have to say, on AJ's example, as far-fetched as it sounds, the yoga studio that gives financial advice, there actually was a business like that here in Southwest Portland where I'm at. There was a business, and unfortunately it did go out, but I enjoyed part of the business because this business did this. They did personal financial planning. They also were doing some kind of spiritual awareness stuff, which included some yoga type thing as well. So they had like yoga classes and all that, but they were also doing personal financial planning. But the part of the business that those aren't parts of the business I would have been into. The part of the business that I was into is they also sold pie. So you could go get a slice of pie and a cup of coffee. So very, you thought it was a far-fetched pivot, AJ, but believe it or not, this is Portland.
This all sounds like the build-up to a punchline. So I cannot wait to hear I don't know if you want to call out that business, but I would love to hear the name of this business and how it ties all of those things together, because it better.
Well, I actually don't know the official name, and so they might, if somebody sees this and knows this, they might put it in I always called it the Sacred Pie, but I don't think that's actually what it was called.
If we're talking about diverse revenue streams, you've got yoga, financial planning, and pie. Like, I don't think you get much more diverse revenue streams than that. Like,
Yes. You're feeding your soul in every way
somehow
possible.
they went under. So what do we know?
yeah. All right.